In a town ruled by whispers and unforgiving glances, Mary's small cabin stood like a beacon of defiance. A widow with no family but a stubborn heart, she opened her doors to a native man whose footsteps had long been erased from the maps and memories of the West. The church, cloaked in judgment and silence, called her charity a sin. Neighbors turned away. Voices dipped low to cast stones behind her back. But Mary's resolve burned brighter than their scorn. The man she sheltered was more than just a stranger. He carried scars deeper than flesh, wounds of displacement, loss, and broken promises that no preacher's sermon could heal. Mary didn't see the man the town feared. She saw a soul seeking refuge, a brother in a land that had forgotten the meaning of kindness. Yet, in that forgotten corner, the church's condemnation echoed loud, threatening to drown out the whispers of mercy. But the West has its own ways of balancing scales. One dawn, when the fog clung low to the ground and the first light barely kissed the horizon, the quiet hum of horses grew into the thunder of hoofs. 50 cavalrymen rode not to punish, but to protect. Armor gleaming faintly in the early light, they formed a guard around Mary's land, a silent declaration that some acts of courage command respect, even when the world refuses to give it. No sermon was preached that day, no trial held, just the solemn presence of men who understood that justice isn't always written in law, but carved in acts of unwavering loyalty. Mary stood beside the man she had saved, watching as the cavalry held the line against the gathering storm of judgment and fear. In that moment, the land itself seemed to breathe a sigh, a promise that some bonds are sacred beyond words. This is not just a story of a widow or a stranger. It is a tale of courage, faith, and the unexpected ways honor rides through the shadows of the Old West. Stay with me, because what unfolded beneath that pale dawn will challenge everything you thought you knew about justice, redemption, and the strength found in standing for what is right. Mary's life was carved from hardship, the kind only a widow in the Old West could understand. Her husband had fallen in a skirmish long before the town had fully grown, leaving her with nothing but a weather-beaten cabin and the weight of a lonely land. Her neighbors whispered that she was stubborn, reckless even, for letting anyone stay on her property, especially a native man whose kind were often treated as shadows, unwelcome and unwanted. But Mary saw something in him, a quiet strength, a dignity hidden beneath layers of pain. The man, named Tyanada, had once been a warrior, a protector of his people, but fate had torn him from the only home he knew. Wounded and weary, he arrived at Mary's doorstep, seeking refuge from a world that no longer had space for him. She didn't hesitate. She fed him from her larder, offered her bed, and shielded him from the cruel eyes of the town. Yet the church elders saw her mercy as betrayal, claiming she defied the sacred order by sheltering a heathen. The church's condemnation was swift and public. Mary was summoned before the congregation, her loyalty questioned, her character assailed. The preacher's voice thundered from the pulpit, warning that harboring such a man would bring divine wrath upon them all. The townsfolk followed, their disapproval silent but cutting sharper than any knife. Even friends turned away, leaving Mary to stand alone beside the man she'd vowed to protect. But Mary's resolve was as steadfast as the mountains surrounding their town. She refused to bend, to apologize for what she knew was right. Each day, she tended to Tyanada's wounds and watched as the color slowly returned to his cheeks, his eyes regaining the fire that years of exile had dimmed. Their bond grew not from words, but from shared strength and mutual respect, a quiet rebellion in a world too eager to divide. Then came the night before the dawn when everything would change. The air was thick with tension. The church's threat hung over them like a storm cloud ready to burst. Mary lay awake, listening to the distant murmurs of the congregation and the soft breathing of the man she protected. Somewhere deep inside, she knew that what was coming was bigger than their fear. It was a test, not just of their lives, but of the very soul of justice in the West. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, the peaceful silence was shattered by the thunder of hoofs. A cavalry, 50 strong, appeared on the ridge, their silhouettes framed by the rosy glow of morning. They rode with purpose, not to punish or seize, but to guard. The townsfolk, expecting a confrontation, stood frozen, jaws clenched, unsure whether to raise fists or prayers. But the cavalry dismounted quietly and formed a protective ring around Mary's land, weapons lowered but ready. The commanding officer, a grizzled veteran with eyes hardened by countless battles, approached Mary. He spoke softly but with unmistakable authority. "This land, and those within it, are under our watch. We answer to a higher law than whispers and fear." His words carried weight that even the church elders could not dismiss. The cavalry was not there as an enforcer of the town's will, but as guardians of a different justice, one that valued honor, compassion, and protection. Mary stood tall beside Tyanada, no longer just a widow, but a symbol of defiance and grace. The man she sheltered was no longer seen as a threat, but as a fellow human deserving of dignity. The cavalry's presence was a declaration that the world was larger than narrow minds and small hearts. It was a promise that justice could be found in places unexpected, and that true courage often comes from standing alone when everyone else turns away. Throughout the day, the town simmered in silence, the usual harsh judgments replaced by cautious respect. People whispered among themselves, questioning old prejudices and the church's harsh stance. Mothers pulled their children closer, cowboys paused their work, and even the preacher's voice faltered in prayer. The weight of the cavalry's vigil was heavy and unmistakable. It was a call for the community to reconsider what it meant to be righteous. And when night finally fell, the cavalry departed as quietly as they had come, leaving behind a changed town and a widow whose life was forever marked by courage and compassion. Mary and Tyanada returned to their cabin, knowing the fight for justice was far from over, but strengthened by the knowledge that they were not alone. The land itself seemed to breathe with newfound hope, cradling them in a promise that honor, once lost, could be reclaimed. In the days that followed, the town's uneasy calm gave way to murmurs of change. The shadow of the cavalry's arrival lingered like a fresh wind stirring stale leaves. Mary noticed new faces in the market, curious eyes watching her not with disdain, but with a cautious respect. Even some churchgoers softened, whispering prayers for understanding rather than condemnation. The man she had sheltered, Tyanada, began walking among the townsfolk with a quiet dignity, no longer forced into the shadows but stepping into a light he'd long been denied. Yet the battle was far from won. Some townspeople resisted the shift fiercely, clutching their prejudices as tightly as their guns. Late-night threats reached Mary's doorstep, and cold stares followed her every step. But she remained unbowed. Her courage was no longer just for survival. It had become a beacon. The kindness she extended was not weakness, but a challenge, a refusal to let fear dictate who belonged or who deserved shelter. Mary and Tyanada found solace in small acts, sharing meals with neighbors who dared to cross old lines, helping a sick child regardless of skin or creed, and tending the land with hands that knew both hardship and hope. Their connection deepened, grounded in shared resilience and the silent understanding that justice isn't a sermon preached from pulpits, but a life lived with integrity. They became a quiet force, weaving threads of compassion into the fabric of a divided community. At night, under the wide expanse of stars, Mary would sit by her window, listening for the faintest echo of cavalry hooves. It was a sound that had come to symbolize more than protection. It was a reminder that the West's heart was not hardened stone, but something still capable of mercy and honor. The land around her home, once marked by exclusion and scorn, now whispered a possibility and promise, carried on the winds that rustled through the sagebrush. The story of Mary and Tyanada was becoming a legend, not just about a widow and a native man, but about the power of standing firm against injustice. It was a testament to how one act of kindness could ripple outward, shifting the course of a community, challenging old wounds, and planting the seeds of change where none seemed possible. And in the heart of the West, beneath skies vast and unforgiving, that was a story worth telling, over and over again. The church elders, sensing their influence waning, called for a meeting, a gathering to reassert the old order and silence the growing dissent. They spoke of tradition, of law, and of divine wrath, rallying those fearful of change. But the town had shifted beneath their feet. When Mary stood to speak, Her voice was steady, her words simple yet profound. She reminded them that faith was not measured by exclusion, but by compassion. She told them stories of Tyanada's courage, his kindness, and the quiet strength that had saved more lives than judgment ever could. Her words stirred the crowd, breaking the grip of fear and suspicion. Some wept openly, others nodded in silent agreement, and a few, long silent themselves, stood and offered their support. The preacher, confronted with the undeniable truth of Mary's conviction and the community's shifting heart, lowered his gaze. The church's power was no longer absolute. It had to earn respect through love, not fear. Meanwhile, Tyanada worked alongside the townsfolk, teaching them forgotten ways of living with the land, healing with herbs, and respecting the cycles of nature. His presence softened hardened hearts, and his stories rekindled a connection to the earth that many had lost. Children laughed where once there had been silence, and neighbors once divided now shared meals and stories under the open sky. The community was being reborn, not through laws or sermons, but through shared humanity. One morning, as the sun rose over the hills, a cavalry rider returned, not with weapons, but with a message. He handed Mary a letter from the commanding officer who had guarded her land at dawn, praising her bravery and declaring the territory protected by both law and honor. The letter was a symbol, a promise that the guardians of the West saw more than lines on a map. They saw the spirit of a people bound by justice and respect. Mary and Tyanada stood side by side, watching the horizon, knowing their journey was far from over. But with the cavalry guarding their land, and a community beginning to heal, they felt a deep, unwavering hope. The West was still wild, still unpredictable, but within its rugged heart, something new was growing. A future where courage and kindness could carve out space for all who called it home. As seasons turned, Mary's cabin became a sanctuary, not just for Tyanada, but for others who sought refuge from a world quick to judge and slow to forgive. Word spread of the widow who stood firm against the church's scorn and the cavalry that guarded her land. Travelers arrived, some fleeing hardship, others searching for a place where dignity was not measured by skin, but by heart. Mary and Tyanada welcomed them all, their humble home growing into a community forged by trust and resilience. The town, once divided by fear and prejudice, began to transform. Old grudges softened under the steady glow of shared meals and collective toil. Markets that once excluded native craftspeople now thrived with their goods. Children of all backgrounds played together in dusty streets where suspicion had once ruled. The church, witnessing the power of change, slowly shifted its sermons from condemnation to compassion, inspired by Mary's unyielding example. But the greatest transformation was within Mary and Tyanada themselves. Their bond deepened into something unspoken yet unbreakable. Two souls intertwined by trials and triumphs. They became pillars of strength, not only for each other, but for a community learning to embrace its diversity. Together, they showed that true faith is tested in the fire of adversity and proven by acts of courage that defy convention. Late nights were spent beneath starlit skies, recounting stories of those who had come before, the warriors, the settlers, the outcasts. They spoke of legacy, not just bloodlines, but the inheritance of kindness and justice passed down through quiet acts. And sometimes, when the wind whispered through the trees, Mary would hear the distant cadence of hooves, the cavalry returning in spirit, guarding not just land, but the very hope they had ignited. This was no longer just the story of a widow and a native man. It had become the story of a community reborn, a testament to the power of standing for what is right, even when the world is against you. It was proof that in the harshest landscapes, courage and compassion could carve out a place where everyone belongs. And as dawn broke over the hills, it promised that this was only the beginning of a new chapter in the West's ever-unfolding story. Years passed, and Mary's land flourished, tended by hands that knew both hardship and hope. Her cabin, once a lone refuge, was now the heart of a thriving settlement where old wounds began to heal. The church had softened, its sermons echoing messages of inclusion and grace, while the townspeople learned to listen beyond prejudice. The story of Mary and Tyanita became legend, whispered with reverence around campfires and in schoolhouses. Visitors traveled great distances to witness the place where courage had changed the course of a town. Some came seeking healing, others searching for proof that justice could triumph in a world often too harsh to believe in it. And those who stayed found more than shelter. They found community, a living testament to the strength born of empathy and unwavering faith. Tyanita taught the next generation the wisdom of his ancestors, how to live with the land, to honor its cycles, and to find peace in its rhythms. Mary shared her story of resilience, teaching that true strength lies in standing firm for what is just, even when standing alone. Together, they shaped a future where history's mistakes could be confronted and hope could flourish. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, a rider arrived at the settlement's edge, a young soldier bearing a letter from the cavalry commander who had once guarded Mary's land. It was a formal recognition of their courage, a declaration that their home was protected not only by law but by honor. The letter was placed in the town hall, a symbol of respect and a promise of peace. Mary and Tyanita stood side by side, looking toward the fading light. Their journey, filled with hardship and defiance, had become a beacon of hope. They knew the West was still wild and unpredictable, but within its vast expanse, they had helped nurture something enduring, a legacy of courage, compassion, and a community bound by love and justice. Despite the progress, challenges continued to test the community's resolve. Some outsiders brought old prejudices, sowing discord with harsh words and threats. Mary and Tyanita faced these trials not with anger, but with steadfast patience and quiet strength. They reminded their neighbors that the true spirit of the West was not lawlessness, but the courage to protect those who could not protect themselves. The town grew stronger, rooted in shared struggles and mutual respect. Festivals celebrated not only the harvest, but the unity forged in adversity. Children learned the history of their home, not as tales of conflict and division, but as stories of reconciliation and hope. Mary's cabin, once a symbol of defiance, became a place of learning and gathering, where voices of all backgrounds found a welcome. One particularly harsh winter, when food was scarce and spirits low, the community rallied together. Tyanita led efforts to ration supplies, while Mary organized warm gatherings by the fire, sharing stories that reminded everyone of their shared humanity. Their leadership was a beacon, guiding the town through darkness and fear, proving that compassion and resilience were the true currency of survival. As spring returned, bringing life back to the frozen land, a monument was quietly erected near Mary's cabin. A simple stone etched with a native symbol and a cross intertwined, honoring the unlikely alliance that had changed the town forever. It was a reminder that faith and heritage, often seen as opposing forces, could coexist in harmony when nurtured by understanding and respect. In the glow of dawn, Mary and Tyanita stood before the monument, hands clasped, hearts full. They knew their fight was far from over, but they also knew something powerful, that true justice is born not in judgment, but in the willingness to stand beside those who need it most. And in the vast, wild expanse of the West, that was a truth worth fighting for every single day. Years later, travelers would speak of the town where the widow and the native man changed the course of history, not through violence, but through unwavering courage and compassion. Their story became a beacon for those lost in darkness, a testament to the power of empathy in a land often defined by conflict. Mary and Tyanita's legacy lived on in the children they helped raise, voices filled with pride and hearts unburdened by old hatreds. The school they built taught more than reading and writing. It taught acceptance, kindness, and the strength found in community. Graduates carried those lessons far beyond the town's borders, spreading seeds of change across the West. On quiet nights, elders gathered by the fire to recount the tale of the Dawn Cavalry, the warriors who came not to fight, but to protect a widow's choice and a man's dignity. Their story was told not as legend, but as a living testament to the idea that the West's greatest battles were often fought in hearts and minds, not just on dusty trails. The church itself transformed, evolving from a place of judgment into a sanctuary of reconciliation. Sermons spoke of grace and understanding, encouraging townsfolk to look beyond fear and prejudice. Mary's courage had ignited a spark, a slow-burning fire that warmed even the coldest of souls. And as the sun set over the hills each evening, the land seemed to whisper a promise that no matter how dark the night, there would always be those willing to stand guard for justice, to protect the vulnerable, and to nurture a future where kindness could flourish in the heart of the Old West. The story of Mary and Tyanada became woven into the fabric of the town, told and retold like the oldest songs passed down through generations. Children grew up hearing of the widow who defied the church, of the native man she sheltered, and of the cavalry that came at dawn to guard their land. Their tale was not just history. It was a lesson, a beacon of hope that even in the toughest times, courage and compassion could reshape a community's soul. As decades passed, new settlers arrived, drawn by the town's reputation for resilience and unity. They found a place where differences were met with respect, where the scars of the past were acknowledged but no longer dictated the future. Mary's cabin stood firm, now surrounded by thriving fields and laughter, a symbol of endurance and the power of standing up for what is right. Tyanada's teachings lived on, not just in stories, but in the land itself. The native knowledge of harmony with nature began to blend with the settlers' ways, creating a shared stewardship of the earth that brought prosperity and balance. It was a quiet revolution, one that changed not only the town, but the spirit of the West. One evening, under a sky heavy with stars, a young girl walked to the monument near Mary's cabin. She placed a small feather on the stone, whispered a prayer, and smiled. She carried with her the legacy of courage and kindness, ready to face whatever storms might come. In that moment, the wind stirred softly, as if carrying the voices of those who had stood guard before her. Because this story, like the land itself, is alive. It reminds us that true strength is found in standing with the vulnerable, that faith is proven in love, and that the West's greatest heroes are not always those with guns drawn, but those with open hearts willing to protect the outcast and the forgotten. Today, Mary and Tyanada's story continues to inspire. It lives in the hearts of those who believe that justice is more than laws written on paper, that it is a living, breathing commitment to protect and uplift each other. Their legacy teaches us that sometimes the greatest acts of bravery happen not on battlefields, but in quiet defiance of cruelty and indifference. Communities across the West and beyond carry their message forward, reminding us that unity grows from empathy and change begins with those willing to stand alone. The cavalry's vigil at dawn is no longer just a memory, but a symbol of hope, a promise that when the world turns its back, courage will rise to guard the vulnerable. In the end, Mary's land was not just protected by soldiers, but by something far stronger, the unyielding power of human kindness and conviction. It is a testament that even when shamed and shunned, standing for what is right can turn fear into respect, silence into song, and isolation into belonging. So as you watch this story unfold, ask yourself, what would you stand for when all eyes are against you? Because the answer may not just define you, but change the world around you. And just like Mary and Tyanada, you might find that the greatest guardians come not with swords or guns, but with hearts brave enough to face the dawn. And if this story touched your soul, if it reminded you of the power within us all to protect and uplift, please consider subscribing to the channel, like the video to help spread these forgotten legends, and share your thoughts below. Tell us about a time when you stood for someone who needed it most. Because when we share these stories, we don't just remember history, we become part of it. The story of Mary and Tyanada is more than a chapter in the history of the Old West. It is a timeless lesson etched into the very soil they defended. It reminds us that true courage often stands in quiet defiance, not with weapons drawn, but with open arms and unwavering compassion. When the world judges and turns away, it is the strength of one heart willing to protect another that lights the way forward. That strength reshapes communities, challenges prejudices, and builds bridges where walls once stood. Throughout this journey, We witnessed how acts of kindness, when met with courage, ripple far beyond the moment. Mary's refusal to abandon her humanity, even in the face of scorn, became a catalyst for change. The cavalry's presence symbolized that justice is not just enforced by law, but honored by those who choose to stand guard over the vulnerable. Together, they forge a legacy of hope in a land often marred by division and fear. As this story settles in your heart, let it challenge you to ask, what would you stand for when the tide of judgment rises? How far would you go to protect those who need it most? Because the measure of a person or a community is not in the ease of their victories, but in the courage they show when standing alone. Mary and Tyanada teach us that even in the darkest times, the light of compassion can guide the way. So as the sun sets over the rugged horizon, carry this story with you, not just as a memory, but as a call to action. A reminder that the legacy of kindness, bravery, and justice belongs to all of us, and that sometimes the smallest acts of defiance against cruelty can echo through generations, shaping a better world. If this story moved you, if it stirred something deep inside, I invite you to become part of this ongoing journey. Subscribe to the channel to keep these powerful legends alive. Like the video if you believe in the strength of compassion over judgment, and share your reflections in the comments. Tell us about a time you stood up for someone when it mattered most. Because when we share these stories, we don't just remember the past, we shape the future.